Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear me clearly. Welcome, everybody here in the room, also the people who are following online, and welcome to the panel here. So today we're talking about gender equality and achieving the climate goals, and we're going to have presentations from the panel. We have on the panel today Dr. Andrew Norton, who's the Director of IAED. We have Sam Bickersteth, who is the CEO of CDKN. And we also have Virginie Lamasson and Ritu Songani, who are the researchers who are going to be presenting the report that you all have in front of you today. We're also going to be asking people who are following online and on Twitter to tweet in their questions. And what we'd like to do is have the three presentations all together and then have questions of clarification or general questions and answer session at the end. And we're hoping to save at least 30 minutes for discussion at the end of the three presentations. So if you've got any burning questions, either tweet them to me or write them down and we can all cover them at the end. So I'm Colin McQuiston. I'm the Climate Change and Disaster Risk Reduction Advisor at Practical Action. And Practical Action were involved in developing this study that we're going to hear more about today. Now, as a person who's been working on climate change and disaster risk reduction for a long time, the question around gender has always been, I think, a key question. And in particular, really making the case why good development, what is the role of gender in good development? And can we really argue why climate-compatible development is not going to be possible if you don't have a gender transformative approach? So we know from the history of development that gender has been recognised as a key part of the development approach. So why is it that in climate-compatible development that we're having to go back to the literature? Why are we having to go back to the development paradigms and say, what is the role of gender? It should be central to all of our work, and it should be central to all work on climate change from the outset. I think we need to be better at making the foundations of why gender is central to climate-compatible development. And that means that we need to look holistically at what we're talking about, both in terms of development and also climate change mitigation and or adaptation. In my field, in disaster risk reduction and climate change, we've recognised gender as a central component of the system that we need to be working in. If you look at the disaster response or disaster management cycle, then within that cycle, if you are gender neutral, you fail to identify critical vulnerabilities of the people that you're trying to help. And I think the obvious example that's widely cited is when a disaster happens and post-disaster relief steps in, that often the shelter or the sanitation facilities totally forget about the gender difference. In preparedness measures, women's occupations, women's activities are often overlooked in the general need to have a drill in place, a siren announcement, and somewhere to go when that disaster strikes. And in recovery and in mitigation works, often when we talk about Build Back Better, we tend to overlook things like the care economy. So we're good at building back maybe houses and infrastructure, but we're overlooking access to water or washing facilities or childcare. So the challenge for the study was very much trying to understand what those gender dimensions of an effective climate-compatible development approach would be, and why gender has to be central to that. The second issue that it was also trying to deal with was the challenge of working in urban areas. We know that the challenge of working on gender is about understanding governance and power, and equally, when we're working in urban areas, it's largely around understanding governance and power. So this study was very much trying to bring these two things together. Understanding the challenges of power and governance in both an urban setting and from a gender-centric lens. We know that tensions exist, and there are many documented in the report that you have today around rural traditions, recent migrants and new urban settings, around old ways of doing things and newer ways of doing things, around natural resource-centred livelihoods versus livelihoods upon which services from the city are far more important. So that's just a very brief introduction to the panel session that we're going to be having today. So first of all, I'd like to pass over to Dr. Andrew Norton, the Director of IAD, to really introduce the topic for everyone today. Thank you.
Colin, thank you very much, and many thanks to ODI and the groups here for the invitation. Let me kick off by congratulating the authors of 10 Things to Know. I think it's a very sharp summary of the issues with good practical messages, and the urban focus works well within it. As it happens, I've just been at the 10th Community-Based Adaptation Conference in Bangladesh, organised by IAD colleagues and colleagues from the International Centre for Climate Change and Development and the Bangladesh Centre for Advanced Studies as a collaboration, which had as its theme building urban climate resilience. So it's an opportune moment for me to be looking at this and thinking about it. And in terms of gender and urban resilience, I came away from that with many observations that resonate with the conclusions of the paper. I think it's a reasonable proposition that kind of marked extreme inequality of any kind will tend to weaken human resilience in aggregate for communities. Solidarity matters for resilience, and extreme inequality undermines that, whether gender inequality or inequality of other kinds. Also struck during the conversations by the diversity of different urban realities, from varying, crudely, obviously, there are many, many differences. Some communities we call urban exist largely on rural and tenure systems and so on, where things expand. There's many different realities within that, and, you can see them, if you like, on a continuum, often from relatively established and relatively more formalised residence situations for the urban poor to highly fluid and highly informal situations. Having just been in Bangladesh, this is striking because climate migration is an incontestable reality in Bangladesh. I think a lot of us are used to discussions about climate change as a driver of migration coming from the drylands, and often there's a sort of hypothetical link between climate change and conflict that then leads to migration, which obviously can be contested. But when you're dealing with sea level rise and the impacts of sea level rise and the way in which sea level rise increases vulnerability to storm surge in particular, it's kind of clear and kind of biophysical. And of course, we know that the science on sea level rise is likely to strengthen, given stuff that's coming out at the moment, on glacier melt in particular. So this is something that's very tangible. There are already people being displaced in Bangladesh essentially by sea level rise, albeit there are other drivers involved, salination, river erosion and storm surge. Mostly those people go to the urban areas, particularly Dhaka, which is taking on board, I think, 400,000 a year or something like that, which must be close to unprecedented, I think, historically. And migration driven by climate change will change and is changing gender roles in ways that we probably don't fully understand yet. We know that there's evidence that kind of extreme social vulnerability produced by that kind of social dislocation can have fairly tangible impacts. Again, in Bangladesh, there's evidence of child marriage increasing in the wake of extreme weather events and cyclones. But maybe there are also opportunities for change as well, which come with that, and for increasing freedoms as well. It's hard to take a positive view when people are sort of beaten into a strategic retreat by climate change, but maybe there are longer term things that can come out of that in terms of changes in gender relations that also may be interesting and not entirely negative. There's also a general literature on gender and urban poverty, which it's important, I think, to remember. I first came across the literature on the triple burden of women, domestic, productive and community management in the urban literature, work of Caroline Moser and others. And the point was made many times at CB CBA that all three roles can be heavily stressed by the impacts of climate change. Women don't tend to have spare time, so increasing labour demands in any of those areas require trade-offs or put stress on people and their health. Another point which came up, which is well made in this, is that if women are not involved in decision-making about the local environment, then their priorities will not be heard. Activities such as cleaning out drains and so on will not benefit from their knowledge and action and may not also reflect their priorities and needs. The empowerment theme, which again is well made in the document. I want to finish up by alluding to two things which I think are sort of future agendas that we can look at, which are sort of alluded to but not explored in depth in this. First thing relates to Colin's introduction, in fact, about what's particular about the urban space. And one thing is the significance of local governance. In the urban space, the level of support from local government tends to be more critical than in more rural environments, bearing on the right simply to remain where you are, the right to access types of infrastructure which go beyond what people can reasonably do for themselves, certain kinds of flood protection and so on, which are beyond the efforts of communities on their own. Public transport, but also maybe particularly dependent for the documentation that they need to get a job. These are rights of recognition, and support in all of these areas can help women and girls establish independence and degrees of autonomy that affect gender roles, perhaps particularly in relation to livelihoods and income. So programming that focuses on the link between women, the community and the local authorities as a key site for building climate resilience would be an area worth exploring. And connected to this, I think there are, again, to be a bit more on the positive side, I think there are positive opportunities, hopefully, which can come in relation to the ways in which green transitions happen in the urban space. Low-carbon cities could potentially, if they're designed right and designed with an eye on the needs of the poor, have all kinds of social benefits, particularly maybe for more settled populations rather than fluid and incoming populations, but many of which are particularly important for women. Improved public transport, safer and easier walking spaces, income opportunities, the Zabaline and the story about rubbish pickers and recycling and so on. Achieving these social benefits, social co-benefits of green transitions is a challenge, and it won't happen without good urban local governance, but it's, I think, worth taking on board as a future direction. And finally, let me commend the research and the authors for taking on the range of issues that they did. The need for gender analysis, the understanding of power relations as well as impact, and the need for disaggregated M&E and data, and also maybe a gendered approach to participation and voice as well. So thank you very much, Colin.
Thank you, Andrew. So keep those questions for later, because now Virginie Lamasson and Ritu Songani are going to present the 10 things to know, the crux of the report. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. So, hello everyone. I am delighted to be here on this panel to discuss about the findings of this research project, and I'm even more delighted to be presenting this report together with Ritu Songani, who conducted the research in India.
Thank you, Virginie, and thank you, ODI, CDKN, and PSC, and everybody here for having me over, because this is a very good opportunity for me also to talk about these issues, though we have been working on gender-related issues for a very long time. But it's not every day that we get opportunities like this. Thank you.
Thank you. So just to provide a little bit of the background on this project, CDKN commissioned this research from Practical Action Consulting, IDS, and ODI to contribute with new evidence on what does it mean to pursue climate-compatible development using a gender perspective and in the specific context of urban areas. The research draws on 3 different case studies in Peru, Kenya, and India. We selected projects that had been addressing climate change issues, whether from a disaster risk reduction perspective, mitigation projects, or resilience building initiatives, and projects which had attempted to use a gender perspective. We wanted to understand a little bit better if gender approaches differ in the context of urban areas compared to rural areas. We also wanted to understand what were the factors that were driving gender approaches, and also factors that were undermining the use of gender sensitivity when implementing climate-related projects. And then finally, we wanted to understand whether using a gender perspective led to better outcomes in terms of climate change adaptation, but also better outcomes in terms of social development, particularly women's empowerment. So these are the research questions that underline this project. The methodology was primarily qualitative in nature. Almost 90 semi-structured interviews were conducted across the 3 different case studies, and 33 focus group discussions were also conducted. So in this presentation, we're going to cover the 10 main messages, drawing from examples from the reports that are available online on CDKN website. And I would like to acknowledge and commend the work of Maria Teresa Arana from Peru, from the Peru case study, Elvin Nukuri from Kenya, and then Ritu Sogani for the Indian case study. So first of all, and the first message we really wanted to highlight is the fact that gender sensitivity matters, and it's hardly a surprise for many of us, many of you, but this statement needs to be constantly reaffirmed. When I read in Ritu's report that women she talked to in Gorakhpur sometimes stop themselves from drinking or eating during flooding events so that they don't need to go to the toilet as often, then I ask myself, are male members of their community aware of the situation? Are city planners going to address inadequate sanitation, and what do they do about it? And also, are development projects recognizing women's particular needs? So gender sensitivity matters for any development planning which are never gender neutral, and this very fact needs to be, again, constantly reaffirmed.
Yeah, it definitely works. I mean, outcomes from compatible development. From this case study that we did in India, the study that we did in Gorakhpur, it was really very evident. It came out very strongly that women are very closely associated with the issues of basic services, and be that water or health, sanitation, food, health, and so on. And it was also felt very strongly because that their association is very strong. Understanding of these issues is also very strong. Their knowledge about these issues is very strong. So if they get involved in the decision-making processes, probably they'll not only help in identification of the problems, but also analyzing it and also kind of coming up with a good climate solutions, and that's what it did. In fact, it was very evident from various neighborhood clusters that we had. In one of the neighborhood clusters, the women's role and women's participation and membership was very low. It was all dominated by men. And there, the things couldn't sustain for very long. I mean, they came to a standstill after a while. The interventions are not making a difference. The committees are not functioning. While in other neighborhood clusters where women had a very strong role to play and a very active role to play, there they have contributed to coming up with very effective solutions as well as very sustainable solutions. And this is the reason why people by the team also who was very closely associated with the CDKN study, they made a statement that had women not been involved in the decision-making processes during the study, probably the outcome that the project aimed at, would have been they would have achieved just 10 to 20% of that outcome. And had gender been an explicit focus of the project right from the beginning, the results would have been very different. The outcome would have been achieved, 80 to 90%. So it was quite clear, very evident from the study that we did in India.
Another key messages that we wanted to highlight is this distinction between urban and rural livelihoods. There is a movement away from traditional sectors such as agriculture and fisheries towards more reliance on business, employment, and daily wages in all 3 urban contexts that were researched. In Peru, women in Cajamarca told researchers that in rural areas they had the opportunity to grow their own food, but when they migrated to cities, if they didn't find a way to generate income for just one day, they are quickly exposed to food insecurity. And this situation aggravate during times of disaster risks. Also, in urban areas, we found that money becomes a necessity to not only access food, but also natural resources, such as water. And in the Kisumu area, in the Kenya report, in times of droughts, water scarcity led to water rationing and also a significant increase in the price of water. But when in communities people cannot necessarily afford piped water, then the poorest members of communities have to rely on cheap borehole water, and this leads to increased competition of water and higher workload for women who are primarily responsible for water supply.
And urban and rural differences emerged during our case study also in India. In fact, I would like to reiterate here that whatever urban-rural differences I would be mentioning here is entirely based on the study that we did, this small study that we did, and we need to have more such in-depth, long studies before we finally arrive at any firm conclusions between the urban and rural difference. But one of the major differences that emerged between the rural and urban in India was that while in rural areas, women are very closely associated with natural resources because the livelihoods are very closely associated with natural resources. And natural resources being climate sensitive, they get affected all the more. But at least the positive side was that because of civil society efforts and also because of some very effective policy implementations in the rural areas, women and men are getting a chance to participate in the decision-making processes, to discuss the issues, the problems, and also come up with solutions. But this was not so in the urban area. In the urban area, though the basic services, the responsibilities do revolve around basic services, the needs like food, health, and so on, but the decision-making processes are not involving men and women for discussing the problems and also coming up with the solutions. So there the things become even more vulnerable, and these are the areas which get affected again by climate change the most. Another very important difference that emerged, based on this study only, is that caste and class both matter a lot in India. But in the rural areas, we felt that caste is more a social divide in comparison to class. And in the urban area, we felt that it's a class which is also playing a very important role, because in one of the neighborhood clusters where people from slightly higher income group, they resided there, women had a lot of difficulty in participating in the decision-making processes. They were not there in the committees as members. They were not participating in the consultations. And that also impacted the final outcomes, as I said earlier also. And one of the reasons why the caste didn't figure in very prominently in the Gorakhpur study is also because 70% of the people, they belong to one caste in this ward where we carried out the study. So probably that could be one reason. But of course, as I said, these need to be discussed and studied more.
And these differences of class or caste emphasize another message that we wanted to convey here, is the fact that climate change impacts only aggravate existing and everyday gender inequalities. When men suffer from alcoholism, when women face domestic violence, their capacities to cope with times of stress are severely undermined because it limits their access to resources. And these everyday inequalities were particularly highlighted in Ritu's report.
Yeah, and alcoholism is something which is not affecting people only in Gorakhpur or in the Maheva ward where we carried out the study. In other areas where I'm working, in the Himalayas also, it is women are affected by this. It's a very real problem, and we are dealing with issues, connected with alcoholism and other its after effects on day-to-day basis. But unfortunately, it's considered to be a little sensitive issue, and organizations, civil society groups don't like to take it up, don't like to touch upon it, because they feel that it might distract from the main focus of the project, without realizing, of course, they are working on gender-related issues, but they just forget actually at times that women deal with these problems on day-to-day basis, and it does affect them majorly. Yes, in India, in the India case study, interventions were made in the livelihood areas also, and it was felt that the livelihood opportunities and options should be extended to women also. But we realized that women did play a very important role, and they get affected also, by the livelihood initiatives. But the increased livelihood opportunities led to definitely increased income, but it didn't translate into the welfare of the family till women, in most of the cases where women became part in the economic decision-making processes. So it just added to the income, definitely, but it didn't translate. It didn't add it to the welfare of the family in terms of improved health or getting spent on education of the daughters as well as sons, till women had a say in decision making. So it did bring about impact, but only in a very limited way.
Yeah, and to add to this, the Kenya report also highlights that women are encouraged to be small-scale entrepreneurs, but they still face social barriers. For example, the excessive demand on their times as wives, mothers, or house managers makes it very difficult for them to successfully operate an enterprise in addition to their daily responsibilities. And then secondly, they often face credit discrimination because they rarely inherit land or any other property, yet a title deed of a property is one of the criteria used to acquire a loan. So it illustrates that a gender-sensitive approach that is just inviting women in meetings or supporting them to make more money will not change or bring about any transformative changes if it doesn't address the social barriers that prevent women from acquiring the same rights as men.
And this is very closely connected with the sixth message also, because it should be an explicit focus right from the beginning. In fact, in the India project, ASEAN project, it was not very much the main component in the objective setting, in the planning, in the approach, in the design, in the monitoring and evaluation, but definitely in the pilot intervention phase, because the team was gender sensitive, they had a very good understanding of working on gender related issues earlier. So, and they got an opportunity to bring in more women. As a result, they did it was gender sensitive in an efficiency way, meaning they were trying to improve the efficiency of women so that they can carry out their roles and responsibility better. But it was not in any way gender transformatory. It didn't lead to. It definitely led to increase in better access to services, addressing the practical needs better. But it didn't lead to, in most of the cases, any transformation, any impact on the on transformation, on roles and relations. And that is the reason why we have been talking about actually most of the time responsibilities of women, but not the responsibilities of men. There have been very, very few cases where one of the things that emerged was very high workload of women, but very few cases emerged, where men were contributing to decrease the workload of women. Very few cases where women actually overcame the barriers, to participate at the ward committee level, at the city level. So those, so it was definitely gender sensitive, but in a very, as I said, more in an efficient way than in an empowering way. It did bring about change in women's condition, but not in women's position ultimately.
One thing that was interesting to try to better understand was when the project didn't use an explicit gender methodology or didn't have gender equality as an explicit objective, the team were still able to implement some sort of inclusive activities because they were relying on participatory planning processes. And these participatory approaches supported or compensated to some extent for the lack of integration of gender sensitivity. This was important for making sure that women would at least have a voice in the meetings, but at the same time, it didn't compensate for the lack of any kind of transformative activities to address some of the social barriers that we just mentioned. But in some cases, such as in Kenya and in India, the fact that women were able to attend the meeting, get involved in designing the activities, meant that they had the opportunity to take on managerial and leadership roles. In terms of the drivers of gender-sensitive approaches, we were discussing that a key driver was the experience of team members when they were aware and able to articulate gender concepts and to use it for their daily activities. Another key driver was the commitment of donor agencies. This has been a quite powerful incentive for organizations to integrate a gender perspective because then they were expected to report against objectives related to gender equality. In terms of the obstacles, in contrast, we agreed with most members of this research project that a major shortcoming is the lack of understanding of gender as a concept, but also a lack of understanding of the reasons why gender equality and gender approaches matter. To be fair, practitioners have to deal with a long list of deliverables when they are working on urban resilience. And bringing a gender perspective is often perceived as complicating the project delivery and taking up more time, and also perhaps raising tensions with communities that they work with, because they're going to generate certain sensitive discussions around power. And sometimes also the project timeframe doesn't allow practitioners to take on this approach. So all in all, it's convenient to remain gender blind. And assume that inviting women in meetings will suffice, but this only maintains power imbalances, and it doesn't tackle the reasons why some people suffer more from poverty and disaster risk than others.
Yeah, as I mentioned in the previous slides also, that gender was not an overarching focus in the CERN project. And in the monitoring and evaluation also, it was not a very important dimension. And it did lead to, despite the fact that it was very transdisciplinary and very participatory in its approach, it did, because of which we lost out on very important opportunities to learn from such outcomes, and also benefit from the evidences which were very clear in terms of women's involvement and how they contributed to women and men's involvement and how they contributed to effective outcomes and sustainable outcomes. And more so in this case in Gorakhpur, because it became slightly gender sensitive in an efficient way, as I mentioned earlier, during the pilot intervention, and it did have a very strong impact on the outcomes. But the documentation was completely gender blind, more or less it was gender blind. As a result, I mean, I feel that, and we all felt, that such projects where sensitivity has, gender sensitive approach has been adopted, but the documentation fails to capture it, there is always a danger of coming to this false conclusion sometimes that gender can be done away with. And when you can arrive at these very effective and sustainable outcomes, then what is the need of bringing in gender sensitive approach? And so it becomes optional. Sometimes it becomes burdensome. And in India, we call gender to be a bawandar. Bawandar is a Hindi word which means it creates chaos. It disturbs the peace in minds of people. It disturbs the peace in family. It disturbs that status quo, at the society level. So what is the point in bringing it in? When you can arrive at such results. Had this study not been carried out, we would not have been able to understand, and come to know about this study also.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So now I'd like to hand over to Sam Bickersteth, who's the CEO of CDKN, to sum up some key points that came out of the report, but also what this means for climate-compatible development in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's a difficult act to follow that, actually. But first of all, I'd like to thank the team, Virginie, the Practical Action team, Caroline, who's with us in ODI, and good morning to our colleagues in Peru, and good afternoon to colleagues in India and Kenya, who hopefully are on the line, for all of their work on this. It's been something of a journey for CDKN, and I think the question I want to pose, not just to CDKN, but programs like ourselves, but perhaps to all of us in the room and those listening, is what do you do with these 10 lessons? Because this has been a kind of a journey to pull this together. I would like to acknowledge Andy as a critical starting point in that journey for his insights that he found time to share on gender dimensions when in the earlier days of CDKN, when you were based here at ODI. So it's really nice, Andy, for you to have returned to this event to share your experience and your kind of live perspectives from Dhaka seem to be particularly relevant. And I think what I found so relevant was this reminder, because essentially these 10 notes, many of you would have observed yourself, but they're notes to remind us in our actions, in our work, in our programming, the reminder that climate change is an additional stressor to existing inequalities. So we're talking about power, as Colin has told us about, reminded us at the beginning, power imbalances and the need to take an inclusive approach. CDKN, the D is very important, is a development program. We need to put development first, and therefore we need to address the issue of who has power and who doesn't. Climate change is shifting already those aspects of power. And as donors and hopefully countries rush headlong through 2016 into implementing the outcomes of the Paris Agreement, are we going to look at these 10 lessons? What are we going to do about this? Because if we miss that, what are we going to be doing? Are we going to essentially perpetuate the status quo, where women can't access toilets or can't do the kinds of things that they ought to be able to do, that Virginie has pointed out? So the question for CDKN and other of us working on climate change, and all of us, I hope, in this meeting, is are we perpetuating the status quo, or are we driving something in Sritu's word that is transformatory, where we not only see that climate action that we need and the urgency of that action, but something that enables a just and inclusive outcome. And so as we've looked at this issue through CDKN over the past years, it's been quite difficult to pull this together. This isn't easy. There's good practice out there in the gender literature, but it hasn't been shone firmly into all of the action that is around climate change. And I think this is a very useful attempt, and I'm delighted to reach this point where we can look at these issues and say, how are we doing? Now, how are we doing not only in projects, but how are we doing in programs? How are we doing in planning? How are we doing in policy? I think this report only starts to open up those 4 Ps. And I think we need to be very careful not only just to think about projects on the ground, but I was looking at these 10 things to know and picking on 1 or 2 or 3 to pick out some of what I see as the kind of gems or the insights in here. And I hope you will have time to read the report, pull those insights out, and perhaps dig deeper into the full country reports that are available online. Andy said, well, you can't look at them separately. What I think is good, and listening to you present, you could see the way in which they're interrelated, and I think we need to be a little bit careful not to cherry pick the ones that suit us best. But I will pick out 2 or 3 with a slight risk associated with that really struck me. And the first one is a simple development lesson that we need to know our context. This is highly development specific. So having said this, we've gone through this journey of drawing out generalities, 10 generalizations, but actually specificity matters. And this is very strikingly drawn out under lesson 3, which is called Location Matters, where we're told the analysis shows that urban cohesion, social cohesion is enhanced as people moved into Kisumu in Kenya, but disintegrates as people move into Gorakhpur. Okay, so just a reminder that it's not the same everywhere, so we need to understand those contexts, do this valuable research, and I think that's the value of bringing this to a place. Secondly, there's a bit of a sense of regret that comes through in these case studies, that gender wasn't integrated at the start of projects. We spot this issue as we go on the journey, and that's the story of climate change, of course, as it realizes you can't look at climate change as a silo. Climate change runs through it. It integrates into the challenges of resilience. We need to integrate it into the challenges of social inclusion. So let's try and integrate it at the beginning. Of course, that's a little challenge for CDKN. CDKN was a big challenge for CDKN. CDKN is in its 7th year. We've commissioned some 400 projects, had published 200 documents, held 200 events like this. We have 1,600 partners and 15,000 visitors to our website every month. How well are we doing in our gender integration across those sorts of statistics? Well, probably we're only on a journey here. But that journey's started, and in Gorakhpur, which is such an interesting place with all its challenges of inequality, and climate change and disaster management. At least CDKN, with its partners, the Gorakhpur Environmental Action Group, did encourage the municipality to really look at gender issues in its climate cell. So there are places where we push that agenda forward. It's also interesting, this observation that participatory approaches can still save the day, in inverted commas. We shouldn't be complacent and say, oh, we've got a participatory approach, all will be well. Gender-sensitive participatory approaches, I think, might be the full sentence. But gender-sensitive programming occurred almost accidentally through the participatory approaches in some of these case studies, and I think that's quite interesting. So the sine qua non is participatory approaches, it seems to me. We can't do without that. We then need to build in the gender-sensitive aspects to that. So the other aspect is at planning and policy level. CDKN supported the integration of gender into the state action plans on climate change in India, and that was widely adopted in those plans. In Peru, not supported by CDKN, I should hasten to add, but by Peruvian actors, the National Action Plan on Gender and Climate Change was instigated, I think it's the right word. Peruvian-based colleagues will be able to describe this better, at COP20 in 2014. So there was a formal policy process to integrate gender into the activity around adaptation, around mainstreaming and adaptation, into mitigation and the sector plans. So all the stuff that's happening around Plan CC, which is the big mitigation plan, and the adaptation plan, which is under implementation in Peru through its INDC, its intended nationally determined contribution. But how well is it doing? How are we doing in implementation, whether it's those state action plans in India or this policy process in Peru? I think we need to know, but there are different levels in which we engage. So I think let's not just look at the project level, but look at these multiple levels. And of course, when we go to the crowning point, or the point, the apex, let's not call it the crown, the apex of the global climate change system, we might go to Bonn, the UNFCCC, where we should congratulate the appointment of Patricia Espinosa as the new executive secretary, appointed just this week from Mexico. So maintaining a tradition of leading women driving action on climate change at the heart of the global climate change process. That's to be celebrated. And the fact that there is a Lionesses Club of women who have actually done a lot to drive through the outcome that we saw in Paris is also to be celebrated. That doesn't get away from the power imbalances and the imbalances that will come about from the transformation that will be necessary in both adaptation and resilience and the mitigation aspects of climate change. So I think my takeaway is there's a great start. I think this is a really helpful report, and I will encourage CDKN and its many partners to have it as a aid memoir in terms of planning and implementing and assessing projects. But it's just the beginning, isn't it? Just the beginning of action on climate change and just the beginning of action on gender-sensitive programming. And I think the case studies bring this to life. We move from the general statements about what we need to do on gender mainstreaming to something that's tangible. So congratulations and thanks again to the many people who've contributed to this. And I think we all now need to say, well, what do we do with this as we go forward? So thank you, Colin.
Thank you, Sam. So now we've got 40 minutes for questions and discussions before we break for a reception. So if you have a question, please can you put your hand up, and if you can state your name and your affiliation, that would be appreciated. Yes, and use the microphone. Thank you.